Okay, Victor, let's look at the Berlin Conference. Let's focus on that today and look at that kind of global history on our next interview.
Yes.
Let's talk about the global conference.
Okay.
Who, when, where, why?
Well, the Berlin Conference was a conference that was held, I think, 1884 to 1885. And it was held in Germany. I mean, and what's very interesting about that conference is that Germany called the conference and all the major European leaders attended. So it tells you, one thing it tells you is that Germany had reached a certain point in its development that was formidable. And we later saw that with World War I and World War II. But yeah, so given that the main players in the world at that time was France and England competing for control of this globe, you had the Germans calling the conference. Yeah.
Now, the conference was called over the resources of Africa.
Yes. Yes. Again, I mean, one of my favorite books is The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations was written by Adam Smith, and this book was published in 1776, which is the year that the United States declared independence from England. Now, that book dissects the capitalist economy. It dissects how it works. It shows you the importance of labor and the exploitation of labor. So Adam Smith's book now was written in 1776. So at that time, England was already an industrial power. In fact, industrialization had began in England. So you can look at it. So now the Berlin Conference was held in 1884, 1885, which is
Go ahead, please.
Which is over 100 years since that time. So it tells you that industrialization began in England. And the reason why it began in England, I think, is explained very well in Jeremy Rifkin's book, which was titled Entropy. And England's an island, and the English used up all the trees to heat themselves, and they had no other trees, so they had to use coal. And by using coal, it generated all kinds of technologies which formed the Industrial Revolution. So we know it began first in England, then it spread to France, and then it spread to Germany. And Germany had the most modern technology. Why? Because they were the last ones to become an industrial power. And they called the conference. And Bismarck, who was the Chancellor of Germany at that time, had unified all the German states, so made them formidable. And of course, they needed raw materials for their industries. And they met together, the conference called by the Germans, to decide how we would carve up Africa so that we could get the raw materials that we need for our industries.
Without war against each other?
Without war. In general, throughout European history, there's always peace when there's a balance of power. And the Europeans have always tried to maintain this balance of power. So this Berlin Conference was designed so that we would maintain the balance of power. So once no one gets disproportionately strong or disproportionately weak, the balance is maintained and there's no basis for warfare. Of course, that doesn't last forever. Ultimately, it fails.
Now, also, this was after slavery had been emancipated in almost every place in the world. So Africa was really a weakened continent and could hardly resist any of the European states. And so they were easily overcome or easily colonized by the European states. Can we talk about that?
Yes, well, certainly with the rise of capitalism, which is based on slave labor and not slavery, the slave system was finished. I mean, it was economically, for the great powers, it was just the days of slavery was numbered because it was inconsistent with capitalism. And again, as far as 1776, which is the date that Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, was published, to me that by that time, slavery had become impractical. So in Toussaint's Louverture revolution in Haiti in 1804, it was just a natural progression. And of course, I must say that the French Revolution was the first European power to free the slaves, the African slaves. So therefore, industrialization really was the sign that it was time to move on to a new system of wage labor, and therefore the English, since the French were the first one to outlaw the slave trade, even though Napoleon, in a kind of bizarre way, tried to reimpose slavery, which of course didn't work. But so you had the rise of capitalism naturally leading to the end of slavery and a system of wage labor, which is what capitalism is based on. Now, I mean, as bad as it really was, but slavery was an industry, and it was how many people, including Africa, made a lot of money. So the English and the French and of course the Americans, they bailed out their planters. Yes. So again, we said that capitalism was inconsistent with slave labor. Their system of production is based on the wage labor, which is we pay you less than you create. All the value you create, we only give you just enough to keep you going. And we take all the rest for ourselves, and we build all this massive luxury and everything else. So, but the key thing is that most of the European powers paid their planters. So their planters had the capital, and many of them just transferred into capitalist production. Because to be a capitalist, you need capital. That's why they call it capitalism. Now, in Africa, I don't think they did the same thing. So many of the people who were involved in slave trafficking as a means of accumulating wealth, they were out and they were weakened. So you had in Africa, which in the 19th century was largely weak in terms of the leadership, in terms of the governance of their state. They had not become, for some unknown reason, they did not transition to become industrial powers. It could be that there was some discrimination even then, or it could be they were not as connected because, again, it began in England, and right across the English Channel is France. And right across the Alsace-Lorraine territory is Germany. So we can see how it just, the movement of industrialization was like a domino. So you had to be near, and it took a long time to reach Russia, which of course is on the outskirts of Europe. So being far from the center of the world system, as Andre Gundefrank would say, or as Immanuel Wallerstein would say, meant that Africa could not take advantage of these innovations and technology and everything else. So Africa was in general weakened and probably didn't see this coming because there were no African invited to the Berlin Conference and no Japanese or Chinese. Even though, again, Japan was aware, at that time, was aware of the world system, and that was a concern of Japanese, but they were not invited to the Berlin Conference. It was strictly Europeans.
And at the Berlin Conference, what did they do?
Oh, they divided Africa. They took portions of it. I mean, regardless, they just wanted, again, access to raw materials for their industries.
But at the same time, say for an example, Belgium. And we can almost look at what was happening with African Americans, because Marcus Garvey was trying to negotiate for the rubber in the Congo, and that ended up going to Belgium, and Leopold of Belgium it's estimated that he killed more than 10 million Africans. And Tip, who was an African, I believe, worked with Belgium in the rubber production, and oversees some of the production of the rubber.
Well,
the Africans, can you?
King Leopold of Belgium, he was related to Queen Victoria, and using those kinds of connections, he was able to get personal control of a large portion of what is today Zaire. And again, he was ferocious. I mean, he pursued wealth. He didn't care about the people there, and as a result, as you say, millions of people died.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, they cut off their hands.
Yes.
They didn't produce enough.
Yeah.
Rubber and etc.
Yes, he did many things to force the production of rubber to feed his thirst for wealth and power. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and even later on. Again, we know one of my favorite African leaders of the Congo. What was his name?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, he had such great plans, such magnanimous plans for his country, which were never realized.
Right, Idi Amin.
No, Idi Amin is from Uganda.
Yes, correct.
But I'll remember.
Okay. Okay. Can you kind of lay out, do you need a map? I got a map here if you want to lay out what European countries took what. I mean, got the control of which countries in Africa, and how those countries then was able to expand their production, and all of them get multi-rich from their colonies in Africa.
Well, yes, but you did mention the African American perspective, and again, one of the main outputs of production of Liberia, which was independent at the time, even though they were not invited to the Berlin Conference, was rubber. So rubber was the main output of Africa at that time. I mean, they just invented inflated tires, which was wonderful for transportation, and this great demand for rubber. Liberia, which is right next door, not too far from, Liberia is really West Africa, Zaire is further down, and of course Marcus Garvey, the great visionary, who wanted to also do something, and of course they would not allow that. The great powers would find him inconsistent with their plans for the exploitation of Africa for their own purposes. In terms of the parts of Africa that were colonized, I mean, the English, of course, were the English and the Dutch. Well, actually, the Dutch were in southern Africa first, but later on, with the discovery of gold, I think the English pushed them out further. But the English were everywhere. So the main countries that pretty dominated Africa were the English and the French. You had some Germans on Northwest Africa and even East Africa. So they allocated a piece of territory just in, all around. Everyone had a piece in Southern Africa, maybe West Africa, and East Africa. So it was done in a way that we wanted everyone to have a piece everywhere in general. So that's a general rule. And then, of course, the English and French, who in general had a presence already. So the English and French, and to some extent the Dutch, had a presence already, and therefore they got more. And of course, again, the English were able to influence to give Leopold some territory for himself, not for his government, for himself in that part of Africa. So in general, we considered the most of the participants of the Berlin Conference had a piece of territory in all the different parts of Africa, West, East, and South. So in general, everyone had at least 3 pieces. Of course, after the war, Germans lost their territory in the west of Africa and in the east and in the west of Africa. And it was absorbed by the English or the French. So that's really the general rule without looking at a map. So now when you look at a map, you may only see English and French, and because the Germans lost theirs, absorbed by the English and the French, and then you would have the Dutch. The Dutch they're not there in a formal way. The Dutch are there like in Southern Africa, and they've been absorbed by the English. So even though Afrikaner, which is a broken Dutch, is still spoken in Southern Africa. But for all intents and purposes, it's really an English country. English culture, English strength, English power really dominates that country.
Now, I find this interesting when we begin to look at Marcus Garvey and the Berlin Conference. Most of our people don't see those 2 episodes in history so well connected right after African Americans get their emancipation. African Americans literally start a relationship to free Africa and to come together, and they worked in many. Not only was Marcus Garvey one of those Africans for Africans and so forth, and trying to develop this relationship with Africa, but here, even in New York, as late as the 70s, before the emancipation of Namibia, I myself participated in many demonstrations at the South African Embassy to free South Africa. I have tapes where we were invited to the OAU in 1984, the Black United Front, and that was because we were working with all of the liberation groups, even as far as to go to Cuba and meet with Castro and try to begin to bring the African liberation groups here in America with liberation groups for Africa all over. So the participation of African Americans is not really talked about and not really understood in its depth. But when Namibia was finally liberated from South Africa, it was, we were invited to the Namibian celebration and so forth. Can you kind of talk about the African American involvement with the liberation of African countries, which are today?
Well, certainly
free.
The African American struggle, which really began in the 60s, affected many other movements. In a way, all these other liberation movements owe their gratitude to the African American struggles of the 60s. And as far as Ireland, as far as the movement by the Irish, the Northern Irish movement, to get justice from England, to get fair treatment from England, they got the idea from us in America when they saw how we were raising hell in the 60s. I mean, they started giving the English hell, and now of course they've prevailed. I mean, Northern Ireland, the area, the cost of living is very well. Quality of life is improved dramatically. So the African American struggle has always had an effect on other peoples and other places. And Marcus Garvey was a visionary. And the thing I like about Marcus Garvey was that he had a sense of economics. He saw a system. So he saw a system of trade between the Africans in Africa and the Africans in America. And he had no problem in returning to Africa. So, because he felt that it was an economy, it was a potential. I mean, the Europeans were not there because they, out of their kindness of the heart. I mean, they were there to make money. I mean, as Marx said, the economic motives are really more compelling than other motives. I mean, other motives are important. I don't want to knock it. But the economic motive, men and women's quest to improve the quality of their lives, the luxury, is more compelling than the idea. So Marx always said the concrete, economic foundations comes first. If you're hungry, you can't make war. You've got to have your belly full. Certainly Marcus Garvey didn't have a problem with return to Africa. He was willing to do that. And he didn't really have a problem with segregation, which is interesting. And in a way, he was a little against the time, even though another key figure in African American history is Booker T. Washington, who was an extraordinary man. And again, he accepted, I mean, in the South, as you know, he accepted this fact that there was going to be segregation. He accepted the fact that he would not be allowed to drink from this fountain or go to that lunch counter. And he, again, as you know, he was the driving force behind the creation of Tuskegee, which is now a university. And it began of humble beginnings. And Marcus Garvey was trying to meet this man. So Marcus Garvey, they were different in a way. But in a way, they accepted the fact that, that there would not be integration. So both Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey accepted that, the history so far had shown that we could not get along. So after emancipation, after the failure of Reconstruction, as documented very well by W. Du Bois, and then you had Marcus Garvey coming after Du Bois. I mean, they had issues, but that's to be expected. But the point is that Marcus Garvey was trying to meet Booker T. Washington. And sometimes I daydream about what would have happened if those two great men had met.
Well, Booker T. Washington was a Pan-Africanist, even though many people don't see him as a Pan-Africanist. Right. But behind the scene and what he was working on and what he was doing in Africa, which is not talked about very often, but Booker T was really a Pan-Africanist, and he was trying to use the model of Tuskegee to set it up also in Africa. Tyra Wright does her book, she does a beautiful job on Tuskegee Institute, Booker T. Washington, and him being a Pan-Africanist. So. And again, just imagine if Marcus Garvey and Booker T had met. They never did. Marcus Garvey was trying to meet him, but he died before they connected. Right.
Yeah.
So even looking at this historic relationship of African Americans, it started earlier than the 60s. In fact, the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, was schooled right here in America, Lincoln University. And when he went back to Ghana and became the president, he invited many of the African Americans to come to Ghana and be a part of the government. In fact, Dr. Clark often speaks of Kwame Nkrumah and his relationship with Kwame Nkrumah, because he did go to Ghana and he did work for a while with Kwame Nkrumah, but it was not just him. There were many African Americans. So they started out to really build this relationship and have us as a part of that relationship. And you can look at the Rastafari movement with Ethiopia. But even that's a history that we need to really look into, because African Americans volunteered to go to Ethiopia to help Ethiopia fight the Italians. And Ethiopia was successful. It is the only African country that has never been totally dominated or conquered. But there was Haile Selassie coming here to the League of Nations at the time, trying to get the involvement of the League of Nations, of which Italy was a member, to help Italy fend off, to help Ethiopia fend off the attacks of Ethiopia. But Ethiopia was very successful in defeating Italy. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because all the time we're mixed into this with African Americans and what is going on in Africa in ways that's not taught in school. You know, so we don't know our close relationship.
I want to emphasize that what drives the ability to fend off invaders is access to technology, and access to the most up-to-date technology, especially in warfare. So we saw that in history. We've seen that if you have the most up-to-date guns, machine guns, you can mow down thousands of people. So, and to the extent that Ethiopia, which is very close to Egypt, which is very close to that part of the world that is part of the world system. So they're more closer to the world system to get access to new technology than, let's say, Ghana, or let's say modern day Tanzania, or modern day Uganda. So the closer to the world system you are, the more that you can get the latest weapons. So the further you are from the world system, which really runs from Mediterranean all the way to India, maybe even to China. So that track where trade takes place. So yes, because Ethiopia was on the tip of that system, they were able to withstand